like reading my YouTube comments. Some of it's complimentary, some of it's critical. Constructive criticism's always welcome. And some of it, they're comments that make you think. Somebody was saying that I only ever reviewed Fantasy Flight games, and that's not entirely true. However, it does make me realise that perhaps I don't touch Euro games quite as often as I should. The problem is that whenever I play Euro games, there tends to be an element of Ameritrash creep in at the edges. Hence today's review, Giants. Giants is a game about the heyday of Easter Island, and very much a Euro through and through. The idea is that you have to chisel out massive stone heads or Moai and move them as far away from a quarry to the other end of the island as possible. At the same time, you'll be chiselling out giant stone headdresses or hats for them and transporting them the opposite way. The simple version is, the bigger the item and the further you move it, the more you'll score when you finally get it onto a plinth or an ahu. So, the whole point of the game is just get something, move it as far as possible, score points. But the thing that works with Giants is the integration of the mechanics with an interesting theme. Easter Island's been a place that's often considered as shrouded in mystery and antiquity. The kind of bittersweet thing is you're playing a point in history where things started to go wrong in Easter Island. The canned version, which you can actually find on the back of the rulebook, which is rather handy, is that the tribes of Easter Island were embroiled in a sort of ancestral cult. They venerated their ancestors and tried to appease them by building the giant Moai statues facing inland to watch over them. The problem is that to move them across the island they needed logs, and the logs came from chopping down the trees, and the trees supported a fragile ecosystem that quickly unravelled. So as I say, it's kind of an interesting point in history as you are charting the beginning of the end. But I digress. Giants works for me, not only because the theme is interesting, and the theme is conveyed through the mechanics, but also because the production values are through the roof. Now, I got this from a cheapo bookshop called The Works, who mysteriously had copies in for 10 quid, and you really feel like you get your money's worth. You get Moai statues cast in 3 different sizes, in 3 different colours. You get headdresses unnecessarily cast in 3 different types. You get different sculpts for every single player colour, including the workers, and the tribe's leader, and the tribe's shaman. You get different player art on the screens, you get artwork on the back of the board. It really is a knockout production. And as I say, this carries through to the sort of mechanics of the game. It works quite simply, but there's actually quite a lot going on. The crux is that everything has multiple uses. That's what's so great about it. You need your workers to be committed to the quarry to chisel out your statues, but you also need them to carry the statues across the board. And in a really interesting twist, you can give away victory points to other players to use their workers. There's a sort of semi-cooperative element. You can pay to use other people's workforce, because the bigger the statue, the more people you need to shift it. I mean, there are caveats. You've got the leader of your tribe who's worth 3 regular workers, either quarrying or transporting. And you've got your shaman who brings on a worker placement element. You've got spots on the map where you can place him in a turn to get you extra things. More people, more tribe markers, you can get the headdresses, you can chop down the trees and get some logs. The logs are perhaps the bit of the game that's the weakest or the least well connected, because you've got a series of hexes. And once you use your shaman, you chop that down and you get the logs, and the logs can be placed with a worker to increase their capacity for moving a Moai statue. But it tends to be that the logs are taken very early in the game with a huge advantage to the first player who gets the largest amount of them. And within at least the first third of the game, the logs are gone and that's it. And once they're used, they go out of the game. So I can understand from a thematic point of view and a historical point of view why it's there, and they certainly are very pretty little components. They actually look like tiny little wooden logs. But it seems a little extraneous. It doesn't add a lot apart from historical accuracy. What else can you do in the game? Well, you can, your tribe markers, what you have to use those for is you can bid with them to be the first to pick a statue from the quarry, and the Moai statues are determined by a dice roll, so you get different ones in different numbers. Sometimes you'll get more than the number of players or less, and it's really interesting. You have that one random variable each turn, but because it's at the start of the turn, before everyone starts playing, it's not just a bit of swingy luck. It informs your decisions for the turn, but it doesn't dictate them. So, Yeah, it's a lot going on because, like I said, your tribe markers, you need them for the auction, but you also need them to gain Rongo tablets, and Rongo tablets can be used as an auction tiebreaker. They can also be used to power up your chief to do the job of the shaman for a turn, in effect getting you 2 worker placement actions. That was a cat quake just there. Stop it, you. As you go on, you find that everything you need for multiple purposes. The Rongo tablets used to be used actually for an additional scoring purpose, but that was taken out of the game in an errata later on, and personally I think rightfully so. It wasn't something that added much, and in fact it kind of harmed the game because you could abuse it as a strategy for racking up victory points. So there's a lot to think about, there's a lot to consider and a lot to do. But like I say, it doesn't come off as fiddly or complex. There are some really interesting quirks as well, the way that the auction is a double bid. You're bidding the amount of markers and the amount of workers. So if you're wrong, you might end up putting in too many workers to the quarry, or you may not have a statue to grab at the end. And for a Euro game, there's plenty of interaction on the board, stuff that you don't usually find. You're able to sort of steal unmarked statues and use them. You could potentially take somebody's Ahu plinth and have it as your own, meaning that they might have moved a statue all the way across the board for nothing. You can, as I said, use other people's workers. There's a lot of ways to interact with other players. You can mess with them to a degree as well, and it adds a little more intrigue. It's not very cutthroat, it's not really brutal and mean, but it means there's not that multiplayer solitaire so much. I mean, if you wanted to, you could try and spend the whole game working on your own, but you're not going to get as far. But there are multiple paths to victory that way. You know, you can take a huge size 3 Moai and very slowly move it across the map to the plinth that scores 10 points and score yourself 30. Or you can take single sort of size 1 Moai and stick them all around sort of the sort of cheaper plinths and then ship all the hats across to them to try and make them worth more points. It does feel like you can pick how you're going to attack it, and that the game won't exactly be the same every time. So now we have to come on to the things that I don't like so much about the game. I've mentioned already that the logs feel like an extraneous extra mechanic. They don't exactly interfere with the game too much, and to be honest, it's not a big niggle. The little log pieces themselves are the first symptom of the game being massively overproduced. They're nice and they're cute, and they're also very lightweight and roll away at the drop of a hat. The Moai statues on the whole are very, very nice, but the size 3 statues are moulded with a slightly curved base that you have to get a knife to and flatten before you can play it properly. The tribe markers that are supposed to fit on top of the statues to show ownership quite often don't, and you have to then boil them in hot water to make sure that they actually will fit. As well as that, you've got the headdresses, and they just loosely balance on top of your Moai and will very easily fall off. There's also things with the player screens. You've got these little flag markers you're supposed to clip over them. They don't fit. It's a bit of a kind of huge list of production errors on such a fancy game. Plus, with the tree hexes, I don't understand why the tree stumps weren't printed on the board. Instead, you have to take them and flip them over rather than just removing them, which would have been easier. It's frustrating, but after about, say, 20 minutes work, you can correct most, if not all, of these problems. And as I've said before, what you get is fantastic. I mean, they even give you a little bucket to keep all the pieces in, spare from the game. I mean, it really is a game where they've considered everything and given you more than you need. It's just a shame that production isn't up to scratch when you buy it and requires a bit of work and a bit of effort just to get the thing into a playable state. I mean, it's not like it's a horrendous mess, but it is kind of annoying. Giants then. I mean, for a game about a particular point in history, it does feel engaging and thematic, and it does feel like you interact with other people, and for a Euro game these things are great. You're not just pushing wooden cubes about, which can be kind of a bugger. The other thing is, and this is a big thing for me, it has two things I love. There's interaction with the board, where you're literally taking your statue and moving it along the board as your workers carry it. And the other thing is progression. From the start to the end of the game, there's this really beautiful progression of the island being populated and deforested, and, well, I know that's kind of grim, but You see the board progress from a start to an end state, and when you've finished, you've got something quite beautiful. It is an utterly gorgeous game, and it plays very nicely, and it's not too hard to teach apart from people grasping the initial slightly unusual auction mechanic. Yeah, it feels almost like a more traditional style of board game in some respects. It's very easy to sort of visualise what you're doing as well. It's hardly surprising that it's well produced. It is by Editions Du Matagot, who also did Kemet and Cyclades and Utopia and Kronos. They always make these really, really beautiful productions. And if you can find it in the works for a tenner, you can't really go far wrong. I'm sure copies will start showing up on eBay. It's almost a given. But don't pay over the odds for it. It's not like a really expensive game. But if you can get it for a reasonable price, I think it's an excellent light to medium euro. It's got a lot of interesting decisions to make, especially the way that everything in the game, with the exception of the little tree logs, has multiple uses and forces you to think about how you're going to use everything. It's not purely worker placement, but it's got a sort of an elevated level of the worker placement game to me. It's not exactly a sort of a much refined version, but it just has enough extra little twists and turns and unusual ideas that make it one that I'm going to play not exactly repeatedly, but very often, and it will hit the table many, many times in the future. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.